They say the truth doesn't need a voice, it just needs the right moment to be seen, and on that night, under $1 million worth of crystal light, the truth was about to walk in wearing diamonds that were never meant to exist in public again. The live stream countdown ticked past 2 million viewers as cameras panned across the grand ballroom in Beverly Hills, where polished marble floors reflected chandeliers like falling stars and every table shimmered with wealth measured in more than just dollars, and at the center of it all stood Imani Brooks, her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence quiet but undeniable, dressed in a tailored black gown that didn't beg for attention but commanded it anyway, the kind of elegance that didn't try to compete with diamonds because it didn't need to. And as the host welcomed the nation to one of the most exclusive jewelry auctions in America, her name was introduced not as the founder of a rising nonprofit, not as a strategist behind one of the most successful charitable expansions in California, but simply as Mrs. Daniel Whitmore, the wife of a billionaire CEO whose empire stretched from Manhattan boardrooms to Silicon Valley investments, and for a brief second, she allowed the title to sit there, weightless, almost detached, because tonight wasn't about being seen, it was about watching, observing, understanding, the way she always had, because power didn't always speak first, sometimes it waited, and the room itself felt like a performance, polished smiles, measured laughter, $1 million bids already being whispered before the first item even appeared on stage. But beneath the surface, something was off, subtle, like a note slightly out of tune, and Imani felt it before she understood it, a shift in the air, a change in rhythm, the kind that comes just before something breaks, and then the doors opened, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who expected the world to adjust to his entrance, and Daniel Whitmore walked in, tailored suit, controlled expression, the same man the media called untouchable, but tonight he wasn't alone, because beside him walked Chloe Harrington. Radiant in a way that felt deliberate, calculated, every step designed to be seen, every glance timed, and the cameras caught it instantly, the angle, the proximity, the message, and for the first time that night, the room didn't just hum with wealth, it tightened with curiosity, because there are moments when people don't need words to understand a shift in power, they just need to see who walks in beside who. And Imani didn't move, didn't react, not when the whispers began, not when the host hesitated, not even when Daniel's gaze passed over her as if she were just another guest in a room full of strangers, because her stillness wasn't weakness, it was calculation, her eyes steady, her breathing even, until something caught her attention, something small but impossible to ignore, a flash of light at Chloe's collarbone, a necklace, intricate, rare, unmistakable, and in that instant, everything else faded, the crowd, the cameras, the sound, because she had seen that piece before, not in a catalog, not in a display, but in a locked case, under her name, tied to something that had vanished months ago under circumstances that never quite made sense, and the realization didn't hit her like a storm, it settled like certainty, quiet, precise, undeniable, and for the first time that night, the woman everyone thought had been placed in the background took a single step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just enough to shift the balance of the room, because some truths don't explode into existence, they reveal themselves slowly, until suddenly, there is nowhere left to hide. The room did not erupt, not yet, but something subtle shifted as if the air itself had begun to listen more closely, because when Imani Brooks moved, even by a single step, people noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because she had never needed to, and now, standing just slightly closer to the center of the ballroom, her gaze remained fixed on the necklace resting against Chloe Harrington's skin, that precise arrangement of diamonds catching light in a way that felt too familiar, too deliberate, and across the room Daniel Whitmore saw it, not the necklace, not yet, but the shift in Imani's posture, the stillness that meant she had already understood something he had not prepared for, and for a fraction of a second, his confidence hesitated, though his smile did not, because men like Daniel did not falter in public, they adapted, they controlled, they redirected attention before it could ever question them, and so he lifted his glass, gesturing lightly as if nothing had changed, as if the narrative was still his to command, but the cameras were no longer following him the same way, they lingered instead, curious, drawn to the quiet center that was no longer silent, because Imani did not raise her voice, she did not confront him across the room, she simply stepped forward again, measured, composed, until she reached the edge of the stage where the first auction piece was being prepared, and the host, sensing the weight of the moment without understanding it, paused just long enough for her presence to register, and then she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried further than any shout ever could, her words cutting clean through the layered noise of wealth and performance. "That necklace," she said, her eyes never leaving Chloe, "should not be here tonight," and the sentence landed not as an accusation, but as a fact, simple and undeniable, and for the first time Chloe's smile tightened, just slightly, the kind of shift that only cameras trained on perfection could catch. Because doubt does not arrive loudly, it arrives as a question that no one wants to answer, and Daniel moved then, stepping forward with a smoothness that had carried him through countless boardrooms and negotiations, his voice calm, practiced. "Imani, this is not the time," he said, the tone gentle enough to sound like concern, but firm enough to signal control, the kind of sentence meant to end a moment before it begins. But Imani did not look at him, not immediately, because this was not about interruption, this was about revelation, and when she finally turned, her expression remained composed, almost distant, as if she were observing something that had already concluded in her mind. "You are right," she replied, her voice steady, "it is not the time for explanations." A pause, just long enough for the room to lean in. "But it is exactly the time for truth," and something in the way she said it made the word feel heavier than the room could hold, because truth, when spoken without anger, without hesitation, becomes something else entirely. It becomes unavoidable. And now the live stream numbers climbed higher, comments flooding faster than moderators could track, viewers sensing that this was no longer just an auction, this was something unfolding in real time, something unplanned, and the host, unsure whether to proceed or retreat, remained frozen in that uncertain space between performance and reality, while Imani reached into her clutch, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, her fingers closing around something small, something that did not glitter like diamonds but carried a different kind of weight, and as she held it at her side, not yet revealing it, her eyes returned once more to the necklace, then to Daniel, and in that silent exchange, the balance shifted completely, because whatever story he had intended to tell that night was no longer the one being written. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a held breath that no one dared to release, because when Imani Brooks lifted her hand, holding that small object between her fingers, the room instinctively understood that whatever came next would not be undone, and the cameras shifted again, zooming closer, capturing the subtle tremor of anticipation in the crowd, the faint flicker of uncertainty in Chloe Harrington's eyes, and the carefully controlled stillness in Daniel Whitmore's posture that now felt less like confidence and more like containment, as if he were bracing against something he could no longer predict. And Imani did not rush the moment, she let it expand, let the weight of attention settle fully before she spoke again, her voice measured, almost quiet, but impossibly clear. 3 months ago, she began, her gaze moving briefly across the audience before returning to the stage. A piece of jewelry was reported stolen from a secured charitable collection, and the words alone caused a ripple, subtle at first, then growing, because people remembered headlines that had flashed and faded, a story that had never quite been resolved, a loss that had been explained but never truly understood, and now that memory was being pulled back into the light, reshaped, re-examined, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first visible crack in a man who had built his reputation on absolute control, while Chloe's fingers instinctively brushed the necklace at her throat, as if confirming its presence, as if suddenly aware that it was no longer just an accessory but a question she could not answer, and Imani continued, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what had always been true, that collection was not private property, it was not a personal asset, it belonged to a foundation built to fund pediatric care programs across the country. A pause, deliberate, allowing the meaning to settle, and that necklace was its centerpiece, and now the room shifted again. Because this was no longer about relationships, or appearances, or social embarrassment, this was something else entirely, something that crossed into responsibility, into trust, into the kind of truth that could not be dismissed with a smile or redirected with a well-timed gesture, and the live stream numbers surged higher, comments racing, viewers connecting fragments of information in real time, while the host remained frozen at the edge of the stage, uncertain whether to intervene or step aside, because the event had already slipped beyond its script, and Imani lowered her hands slightly, revealing what she held, a simple access card, unremarkable at first glance, but those who understood systems, who understood how power moved behind closed doors, recognized it instantly for what it represented: authorization, clearance, entry, and she held it not as evidence to display, but as a symbol of something deeper, something that could not be explained away. Only 3 people had Access to that collection, she said, her eyes now meeting Daniel's directly, steady, unwavering, the security director, the foundation trustee, another pause, quieter this time, and you, and the final word. Did not echo, it settled, heavy, final, leaving no space for interpretation, and for the first time Daniel stepped forward not as a figure in control, but as someone forced into response, his voice lower now, more deliberate. You are making assumptions, he said, carefully, choosing each word as if precision alone could contain the situation. But Imani did not react to the deflection, she did not argue, because this was never about assumptions, it was about alignment, about placing truth beside fact until denial could no longer stand, and she took one final step closer, closing the distance not physically but symbolically, because the space between them was no longer defined by marriage or status, it was defined by what had been hidden and what was now visible, and her voice softened, not in weakness, but in certainty. No, she said, I am remembering, and in that moment, the narrative shifted completely, because memory, unlike accusation, does not need to prove itself, it simply waits to be recognized, and now, under the relentless clarity of light and camera and attention, there was nowhere left for anything to remain hidden. Daniel Whitmore did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than any denial ever could, because a man who had built his empire on precision was now calculating something he had never planned for, not just the presence of evidence, but the way it was being revealed, calm, controlled, impossible to interrupt without making it worse, and around them the room had shifted entirely, no longer a place of celebration but a space of observation, where every guest, every investor, every camera lens was no longer watching for entertainment, but for truth, and Imani Brooks stood at the center of it without raising her voice, without stepping beyond the boundaries of composure, because she understood something Daniel did not, that power was not about controlling the room, it was about letting the room see what had always been there, and when she spoke again, her tone did not change, it remained steady, almost reflective, as if she were recounting something already finished. When the report was filed, she said, her eyes briefly lifting toward the chandelier light before returning to him, there were inconsistencies, and the word did not accuse, it illuminated, because inconsistencies were not emotional, they were factual, they did not rely on interpretation, they demanded examination, and she took a breath, slow, measured, the security footage was incomplete, the timeline did not align, and the internal audit closed faster than protocol allowed. A pause, letting the pattern form in the minds of everyone listening, and I trusted you when you said it was handled, and there it was, not anger, not accusation, but something far more unsettling, trust, named clearly, placed directly in front of him, because betrayal only holds weight where trust once lived, and Daniel shifted then, just slightly, his hand tightening around the glass he still held, the only sign that control was no longer absolute, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the edge of someone attempting to regain ground that had already shifted. Beneath him, you are misinterpreting internal procedures, he said, each word carefully measured, but lacking the certainty it once held, and Imani did not interrupt, she allowed him to finish, because interruptions were unnecessary when the truth was already visible, and when he fell silent, she stepped closer to the stage, her presence now impossible to ignore, and lifted her hand again, this time revealing the small object fully, the access card catching just enough light to draw attention. This card was used at 2:17 in the morning, she said, her voice still calm, still precise, not by security, not by staff, but by someone with executive override clearance, and now the room reacted, not loudly, but collectively, a subtle intake of breath, a shift in posture, because executive override was not a casual detail, it was authority at the highest level, and she turned the card slightly, letting the camera capture its identification code, a number that meant nothing to most, but everything to those who understood how systems recorded truth even when people tried to rewrite it, and Daniel's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough, the confidence that had once defined him now replaced by something more rigid, more contained, because he knew what that number represented, and more importantly, he knew that she knew, and Chloe, standing just a step behind him, seemed smaller now, her earlier poise dissolving into uncertainty as her hand dropped from the necklace, as if even touching it had become a liability, and Imani's gaze softened slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the room, because this was never just about one man, it was about what had been allowed to exist in silence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet finality, the system does not forget, she said, even when people hope it will, and the sentence settled over the room like a closing door, because it left no space for denial, no room for reinterpretation, only the clear, unspoken understanding that what had been hidden was no longer hidden, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more enduring, the simple, undeniable presence of truth. No one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because the moment had reached a point where words no longer controlled the outcome, and Imani Brooks understood that better than anyone in the room, because she had not come here to argue, she had come to reveal, and now that the structure of truth had been laid out piece by piece, she did something no one expected. She stepped back, just slightly, creating space instead of filling it, because silence, when placed correctly, forces others to respond, and Daniel Whitmore felt that shift immediately, the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction, from the guests who no longer saw him as untouchable, from the investors whose confidence depended on certainty, from the cameras that captured every second without mercy, and for the first time that night, he did not look at Imani, he looked at the room, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Control, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried a different tone now, not authority, but defense. You are presenting a narrative without full context, he said, choosing words that sounded structured, deliberate, but lacked the power they once held, and Imani listened, not interrupting, because she did not need to, and when he continued, there were internal decisions made to protect the foundation's reputation. The sentence landed with less impact than he intended, because the room had already moved beyond explanations. It was now measuring credibility, and credibility, once questioned, does not return easily, and Chloe shifted beside him, her posture no longer confident, her hand lowering from the necklace as if even being seen with it had become a burden, and for the first time, she looked at Daniel not with admiration, but with uncertainty, because the story she believed she was part of was unraveling in real time, and Imani watched that shift, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was never about Chloe, it was about the choices that had led here, and she stepped forward once more, not to reclaim space, but to complete something that had already begun, and her voice, when it came, was softer now, but carried a precision that made every word impossible to ignore. Reputation is not protected by hiding the truth, she said, her eyes meeting Daniel's again, steady, unwavering. It is defined by how you handle it when it is exposed, and the sentence settled into the room like a final piece of a structure that could no longer be taken apart, and she lifted her gaze briefly toward the cameras, not performing, not addressing the audience directly, but acknowledging their presence, because this moment was no longer contained within the walls of the ballroom, it had extended beyond it, into living rooms, into offices, into conversations that would continue long after this night ended. And then she did something even more unexpected. She did not accuse him of theft, she did not raise her voice, she did not demand an explanation. Instead she asked a single question, calm, precise, impossible to dismiss. If the system recorded your access, she said, and the piece was never recovered, then how did it end up here? And the simplicity of the question carried more weight than any accusation could, because it did not suggest guilt. It revealed it, and Daniel's silence in response was louder than any denial he could have offered, because there are moments when speaking only confirms what silence already admits, and around them, the room shifted again, not dramatically, but decisively, the subtle realignment of perception, of trust, of power, and Imani lowered her hand, the access card no longer needed as evidence, because the truth had already taken its place, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to exhale, not in relief, but in completion, because this was not the end, it was the turning point, the moment where what had been hidden became visible, and what had been controlled began to unravel, not through force, but through something far more powerful, the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. The question did not echo, it settled, and in that stillness something irreversible took shape, because when a truth is framed with precision it does not need repetition, it only needs recognition, and Daniel Whitmore understood that the moment he did not answer, not because he could not speak, but because any answer would only confirm what had already been revealed, and for the first time in years, the room no longer moved with him, it moved around him, away from him, as if instinctively creating distance from something that could no longer be trusted, and the investors closest to the stage shifted their stance, subtle but unmistakable, glasses lowered, conversations paused, eyes no longer filled with admiration but calculation, because trust in that world was not emotional, it was currency, and once it began to devalue, it dropped fast, and Imani Brooks watched it happen without satisfaction, without visible reaction, because this was never about watching him fall, it was about allowing the truth to stand on its own, and Chloe Harrington felt it too, the shift, the weight, the attention that no longer admired her but questioned her, and her hand rose again instinctively to the necklace, fingers brushing against the diamonds that now felt heavier than before, not because of their value, but because of what they represented, and she looked at Daniel, searching for reassurance, for explanation, for anything that would restore the narrative she believed in, but what she found instead was silence, controlled, deliberate, but empty, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have said, and Imani stepped forward one final time, not to confront, but to conclude, her presence calm, grounded, unshaken, and her voice, when it came, carried a quiet authority that did not ask for attention. It commanded understanding. There is something else, she said, and the room leaned in again, because now everyone understood that each word she chose was intentional, that nothing she said existed without purpose, and she reached into her clutch once more, not hurried, not dramatic, and withdrew a folded document, its edges crisp, its presence understated, and she held it lightly, not as a weapon, but as a final piece of alignment. The internal audit you referenced, she continued, her eyes steady on Daniel, was completed in under 48 hours, a pause, allowing the detail to settle, but standard protocol requires a minimum of 5 business days for review, cross-verification, and external confirmation, and the distinction was subtle, but devastating, because it revealed not just an action, but a deviation, a deliberate choice to bypass the structure designed to protect integrity, and Daniel's expression tightened again, the mask of control now visibly strained, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about procedure, and procedure, when broken, leaves a trace that cannot be erased, and Imani lowered the document slightly, her tone unchanged. You signed off on that audit personally, she said, and the sentence did not accuse, it completed, because it connected every piece that had been placed before it, forming a line that could no longer be broken, and the room responded, not with noise, but with understanding, a collective shift in perception that did not need words to confirm it, and Chloe's hand dropped from the necklace entirely now, her posture uncertain, her confidence dissolving as she took a small step back, as if distance might separate her from the moment unfolding. But distance does not undo truth, it only reveals how close one has always been to it, and Imani's gaze moved briefly across the room once more, acknowledging the presence of those who had witnessed it all, not as an audience, but as observers of something real, something unscripted, and then she looked back at Daniel, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity, the kind that comes when something long questioned finally becomes undeniable, and her final words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried a weight that settled into every corner of the room. You did not lose control tonight, she said, her voice steady, precise. You revealed what you had been protecting all along, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was complete, because in that moment, everything that had been hidden had been brought into the light, and there was nothing left to obscure it. The silence did not break into chaos, it transformed into distance, the kind that forms instantly when trust disappears, and across the ballroom, people who had once leaned in toward Daniel Whitmore now leaned away, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to redraw the invisible lines that defined power in a room like this, and Imani Brooks stood at the center of that shift without moving, because she no longer needed to. The truth had already done the work for her, and the cameras, still streaming to millions, captured every detail, every glance, every hesitation, turning a private unraveling into a public record that could not be undone, and Daniel felt it. Not just in the eyes around him, but in the absence of support, the lack of interruption, the way no one stepped forward to redirect the moment, because there are times when influence disappears not through confrontation, but through quiet withdrawal, and this was one of them, and Chloe Harrington took another step back. Subtle but unmistakable, as if distance might separate her from what was now undeniable, her hand no longer touching the necklace, her posture no longer aligned with his, because proximity, once an advantage, had become a risk, and Imani noticed it, not with judgment, but with understanding, because people do not always choose truth. But they always respond to it, and when she finally spoke again, her voice did not rise, it softened, carrying a calm that felt almost reflective. This was never about one night, she said, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to Daniel, and it was never about who stood beside you, and the sentence reframed everything, because it removed the distraction, the performance, the illusion that this moment had been created by circumstance, and replaced it with something far More precise, pattern, intention, decision, and Daniel's expression hardened, not in strength, but in resistance, the kind that appears when control has already been lost but has not yet been acknowledged, and he straightened slightly, as if posture alone could restore what had shifted, but posture does not change perception, and perception, once altered, does not return easily, and Imani took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but completion, because she understood that this was the point. Where truth no longer needed explanation, it only needed to be recognized, and she reached toward her left hand, the gesture small, almost unnoticed at first, until the light caught it, the ring, simple, elegant, a symbol that had once defined everything people believed about them, and she held it there for a moment, not as a display, but as a reminder, because symbols carry meaning only as long as the truth behind them remains intact, and then, without hesitation, without drama, she slid it from her finger, the motion steady, deliberate, and placed it on the edge of the stage between them, not thrown, not forced, simply set down, as if returning something that no longer belonged to her, and the sound it made, barely audible, seemed to echo louder than any voice in the room, because everyone understood what it meant, not the end of a moment, but the end of a narrative that had been built on something no longer real, and Daniel looked at it, just for a second, his expression unreadable, but the stillness in his reaction spoke clearly, because there are moments when even the most controlled individuals cannot disguise what they have lost, and Imani met his gaze one last time, not with anger, not with regret, but with clarity that had taken years to form, and her words, when they came, were quiet, final, impossible to misunderstand. "You did not betray me tonight," she said, her voice steady, each word placed with intention. "You revealed how long you have been doing it," and the sentence closed the space between past and present, removing any illusion that this moment was isolated, and the room understood it, not as a statement, but as a conclusion, and then she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same composed certainty that had carried her through every second of this night, and began to walk away, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, as the cameras followed, as the room remained silent, as the narrative shifted completely, because she was not leaving something behind, she was stepping out of something that no longer had the power to define her. The sound of her heels against the marble floor did not echo loudly, but it carried, steady and unhurried, marking each step away from a life that had just unraveled in full view of the world, and as Imani Brooks moved toward the exit, the cameras followed instinctively, not because she demanded it, but because the story had shifted, and everyone understood that the center of power in that room was no longer where it had been moments ago, and behind her, the silence began to fracture, not into chaos, but into quiet conversations, low voices, the kind that reshape reputations in real time, and Daniel Whitmore remained where he stood, the space around him no longer filled with admiration but with distance, the kind that cannot be commanded away, and for a brief moment, he looked toward her retreating figure, not calling out, not stopping her, because even he understood that some exits are not meant to be interrupted, they are meant to be witnessed, and Chloe Harrington stood frozen. Just a few steps behind, her reflection caught in the mirrored columns lining the ballroom, the necklace still resting against her collarbone, but now it no longer shimmered with allure, it weighed visibly, as if the light itself had changed its meaning, and she reached up slowly, her fingers brushing against it again, but this time there was no confidence in the gesture, only hesitation, as if she were realizing that what she wore was not a symbol of status, but evidence of something she had never fully understood, and without a word, she unclasped it, the motion careful, deliberate, and for a second she held it in her hand, staring at it as if seeing it clearly for the first time, before lowering it, uncertain, no longer sure where it belonged, and across the room, a member of the foundation board stepped forward quietly, not confronting, not accusing, simply observing, because the truth did not require confrontation anymore, it required acknowledgement, and the live stream continued, millions still watching, comments flooding in faster than they could be read, the narrative expanding beyond the room into a public space where perception would not be easily controlled again, and Imani reached the entrance, the tall glass doors reflecting her image back at her, composed, unshaken, unchanged in posture but entirely transformed in meaning, and she paused there for just a moment, not to hesitate, but to recognize, because leaving is not always about escape, sometimes it is about closure, and she allowed herself one quiet breath, steady, grounded, before stepping forward into the night air of Beverly Hills, where the noise of the city felt distant compared to the silence she had just left behind. And inside, Daniel finally moved, not toward her, but toward the space she had vacated, his eyes falling briefly to the ring still resting on the edge of the stage, untouched, undeniable, and for the first time, the image of control he had built began to fracture in a way that could not be hidden, not from the room, not from the cameras, not from himself, and the event that had been planned as a display of wealth and influence had become something else entirely, a moment of exposure that would not fade with the closing of the night, and as the doors behind Imani closed softly, separating her from the room and everything it represented, the story did not end, it shifted, because what had been revealed could not be unseen, and what had been lost could not be reclaimed. Through silence. The night air felt different, not colder, not quieter, but clearer, as if something invisible had finally been removed, and Imani Brooks stood just beyond the glass doors, the reflection of the ballroom still faintly visible behind her, a world she had once belonged to now reduced to a distant image framed by light and silence, and for a moment she did not move, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that endings, real endings, deserve to be acknowledged, not rushed past, and inside, the room she left behind was no longer the same, conversations no longer whispered but measured, cautious, recalibrating, because in a world built on perception, one exposed truth has the power to rewrite everything, and Daniel Whitmore stood in the center of it, not abandoned, but no longer followed, the difference subtle but absolute, as he looked down at the ring resting on the stage. The symbol that once completed his image now reduced to something else entirely, something that marked a conclusion rather than a promise, and for the first time in years, there was no immediate solution, no strategic response, no controlled narrative waiting to be deployed, only the quiet recognition that some outcomes cannot be reversed once they have been seen, and Chloe Harrington, standing at the edge of the room, no longer attempted to remain part of the moment, the necklace now held in her hand instead of worn, her posture uncertain as she stepped further away, understanding. Without being told that proximity to power means nothing when that power begins to fracture, and the board members, the investors, the observers who once aligned themselves with certainty now shifted toward distance, because trust, once broken in public, does not ask for explanation, it simply withdraws, and outside, Imani finally moved, her steps carrying her forward along the quiet Beverly Hills street, each one steady, intentional, not escaping, but progressing, because what she had left behind was not just a relationship, it was a structure built on something that no longer existed, and as she walked, the weight she had carried for months, perhaps longer, did not fall away. Dramatically, it lifted quietly, replaced by something far more lasting, clarity, and she paused again briefly, not looking back, because there was nothing left behind that needed her attention, and in that stillness she allowed herself a single thought, not of loss, not of anger, but of understanding, that truth does not destroy what is real, it reveals what never was, and the city lights stretched ahead of her, steady, unchanging, a reminder that life continues not with noise, but with direction, and somewhere behind her, beyond the glass and the cameras and the conversations that would continue long into the night, a narrative had ended, not with confrontation, not with chaos, but with something far more definitive, exposure, and as Imani continued forward, her silhouette blending into the rhythm of the city, one thing remained certain, she had not walked away empty, she had walked away free, and in a world where everything can be bought, controlled, or shaped, that was the one thing no one could ever take back.